I never thought silence could be so loud. The only sound in the room was the quiet scratch of my pen sliding across paper. The black ink bled into the line marked Lily Martinez, sealing away 3 years of a life I never thought I'd grow attached to. One last signature, and it was done. Across the table, David Torres sat as if carved from marble, unmoving, unfeeling. His steel blue eyes scanned the document with the same detachment he reserved for quarterly reports or contract renewals. To him, this was just another business transaction. I set the pen down, carefully, like breaking porcelain. "That's everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. No hesitation, no flicker of emotion. He picked up the papers and tapped them neatly together as if tidying away a trivial task. "Thank you, Lily," he said. "I'll have my assistant file the final copy with the court." I hated how formal he sounded, like we were strangers, like we hadn't shared a bed, even if only out of convenience for the past 1,000 days, like we hadn't once laughed in the middle of the night, eating cheap ramen after a power outage. I stood up, my legs heavier than they should have been. Right, of course. He walked me to the door of the office, his office, one I was no longer entitled to enter without invitation. There were no goodbyes, no final words, just the mechanical click of the door unlocking. As I stepped out into the hallway, the cold air hit me like a slap. My fingers trembled, and I wrapped my arms around myself, though I wasn't sure if I was shivering from the temperature or something else. I told myself this was what I wanted. We both got what we signed up for. 3 years ago, I entered this marriage for survival, for my mother's medical bills, for a chance to breathe. I told myself I wouldn't fall for him, that it was a contract, not a fairy tale. But now that it was over, why did I feel like I just lost something irreplaceable? I took a few steps down the hall, the finality of it all pressing down on my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. And then, for a split second, I paused. Something was wrong. I didn't know what or why, but a cold dread began to bloom in the pit of my stomach. My gaze drifted back to the door, half expecting it to swing open, for David to call out to me, to say anything. But it remained shut. Sealed, just like him. I turned away, walking faster now, as if I could outrun the ache building in my chest, but even then, some part of me already knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd told myself I was just walking to clear my head, to escape the suffocating stillness of my apartment, the silence that had taken David's place the moment I shut the door behind me this afternoon. But somehow, my feet led me to the edge of the city where the skyline bled into a soft orange hue, where the world looked like it was on fire in the most beautiful way. The sun was setting, and so was something else. I stood near the curb, half lost in thought, watching the traffic shift in lazy waves when I saw it, him. David, tall, unmistakable, golden hair catching the last of the dying light like a halo. He was on the other side of the street, talking on the phone, his expression unreadable from this distance. Before I could even think to call out his name, a blur of movement shattered the stillness. A truck, too fast, too close, too wrong. "David," I screamed. But the sound was drowned by the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the sickening crunch of metal against flesh. Time slowed, then it stopped. He was lying there, on the pavement, crumpled like a broken doll. People screamed, horns blared. Someone called emergency services, but it was all a distant hum. I was already running, no, flying toward him, heart pounding so loud it might burst. "David," I choked out, dropping to my knees beside him. His eyes, those cold, steel-blue eyes, were wide open, not with indifference, but with pain and fear. His lips moved barely, like he wanted to say something, like maybe, in those final seconds, the mask he always wore cracked. "Stay with me, please, please, don't do this," I begged, grabbing his hand. It was already going cold. The paramedics arrived, voices clipped and urgent, but I could already see it in their eyes, that quiet knowing, that helplessness. I didn't let go of him, even as they tried to push me back. He wasn't supposed to die. Not like this. Not today. Not when I hadn't told him the truth. Not when I had just realized I still loved him. Tears blurred my vision. My body trembled. The world spun around me in colors too harsh, too loud. And then the monitor flatlined. "David," I screamed, raw and feral, as if the force of his name on my lips could pull him back from the brink. But he didn't move. He never would again. I woke up gasping. Sweat clung to my skin like a second layer. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, wild and erratic, as if it were trying to claw its way out. I sat up, pressing a shaky hand to my lips. The images still flashed in my mind, the screech of tires, David's body crumpled on the pavement, the deafening silence that followed the scream of his name. I'd watched him die, but now I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner. The familiar lavender scent of our room floated gently around me. Our room. No, that couldn't be right. This place had felt cold and lifeless for months. I had packed my things. I had left. But now, everything was back, as if nothing had changed, as if I'd never signed the divorce papers. I turned slowly. The calendar on the wall above my desk caught my eye. I stared at the date, my mouth parting in disbelief. 100 days before the accident. No, I whispered, my fingers trembling as I reached for my phone to double-check. The screen glowed back at me, confirming the same date. My heart dropped into my stomach, a rustling sound, then footsteps. I looked up just in time to see the door open. And there he was, David, alive, wearing a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, hair damp like he'd just stepped out of the shower. His expression was its usual unreadable mask, calm, composed, detached. He paused at the doorway when he saw me sitting upright in bed, clutching the sheets like they were the only thing keeping me grounded. "You're up early," he said. Just like that. Like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just watched him die hours ago, or whatever this was. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed around my scream. He glanced at me, his gaze flicking to the sweat beading on my forehead. "Nightmare?" I nodded. It was the safest lie I could manage. He didn't press. He never did. With a short nod, he turned and walked toward the closet, grabbing a tie from the drawer like this was any other ordinary morning. But it wasn't. David was alive, and I had somehow been thrown back in time, given a second chance. I should have said something. I should have told him right then and there. But instead I stayed quiet, frozen, terrified that if I spoke the truth aloud it would vanish. So I watched him, just like I would for the next 100 days. Because this time, I wasn't going to let him die. I began watching everything. The way the light streamed into the kitchen that morning, catching the rim of David's coffee mug, the sound of the news anchor's voice on TV, reporting the same stories I'd already lived through, even the exact words David used when his assistant called him. Word for word, tone for tone. This wasn't a dream. I hadn't just imagined the accident. I hadn't imagined losing him. The world around me was moving on a familiar track, and I was the only one who knew it. I had been sent back, somehow, by fate, by grief, by some cruel miracle. I was reliving the last 100 days before David's death. And yet it wasn't just the calendar or the repeated headlines that proved it. It was the silence. The hollow silence between David and me. 3 years of living side by side in the same house, and we barely knew each other. Our conversations were shallow, polite, transactional. We'd built invisible walls to protect ourselves from vulnerability. And now that I knew how it all ended, those walls felt unbearable. Every word he didn't say hurt more than it ever had before. I saw now what I hadn't before, the way he avoided my gaze, the nights he stayed at the office longer than necessary, the loneliness in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. He hadn't just been cold, he'd been hurting too. I'd loved him in silence, he'd protected himself with distance, and somehow that was the story of our marriage. But this time, I wouldn't let it end the same way. I didn't know how or why I'd been given this second chance, but I wasn't going to waste it. I didn't care if I had to follow him like a shadow, rewrite every moment, change every choice. I would find a way to save him, even if it meant breaking my own heart again. I became obsessed with watching him. Every time David left the house, I found an excuse to tag along. When he drove to work, I insisted on riding with him, blaming traffic anxiety. At lunch, I dropped by unannounced with excuses like, "You forgot your tablet," or "I was nearby." When he worked late, I sat on the couch in his office pretending to read, pretending not to notice the way he stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I couldn't tell him the truth. How could I explain that I'd already watched him die once, that I still saw his blood on the pavement every time I closed my eyes? So I hovered. I unplugged appliances. I made him change routes. I accidentally double-booked his meetings to keep him away from certain places. Subtle at first, then less so. "You've been clingy lately," he said one evening. staring at me across the dining table with narrowed eyes. Clingy. God, was that how it looked? I laughed it off. I guess I'm just trying to be a better wife. His fork paused midair. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me, those icy blue eyes tracing my face like he was trying to find the cracks in my smile. "You've never cared about being a wife before," he said quietly. The words stung, more than they should have. Because he was right. I had always followed the rules of our contract, played the part, stayed polite, detached, safe. But I'd watched him die, and it had torn something open inside me. A part of me that hadn't realized how deep my love had rooted, even in the frozen soil of our marriage. Now I would do anything to keep him alive, even if it meant losing his trust along the way. "You're right," I whispered, setting my fork down. "But maybe. I care now." His gaze lingered on me for a moment too long. Then he looked away, jaw tight, like he was trying to hold something back. Suspicion? Confusion? Emotion? I didn't know. But I could feel the shift, the delicate tug between us, like the world was giving us one more chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. It happened one morning, just after breakfast. I was washing the dishes, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, the sound of clinking plates filling the quiet kitchen. David was at the table, reading through his emails, his focus so intense that I could almost feel the tension radiating from him. And then it happened. I caught the slightest glimmer out of the corner of my eye. David's lips twitching upwards, the faintest hint of a smile. Not at me, not directly, but at something I didn't see. A private joke, perhaps, or just a passing thought that made him soften for a split second. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but it struck me. In the years we'd spent together, I had never truly noticed those moments, those little cracks in his carefully built wall. The quiet moments when he let down his guard just for a second. I turned my gaze back to the dishes, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't imagined it. The smile was real. It was real, and it was for me. Just not in the way I had ever thought. I swallowed, trying to ignore the stirring in my chest, but it wasn't easy. David Torres was cold, distant, always so focused on the future that he never seemed to live in the present. And yet there were these moments, these tiny glimpses of something warmer, something more human. He cleared his throat, snapping me out of my thoughts. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I can handle the dishes." I glanced at him, half expecting to see that detached, businesslike expression on his face, but instead his eyes were softer, almost like he cared. "No, I don't mind," I said, forcing a smile. "I like taking care of things." There was a pause before he responded. "You're always so careful, so perfect in everything you do." Perfect. The word was both a compliment and a cage. It made me feel seen, but it also reminded me of the distance between us. It was a compliment, but one that came with the heavy weight of our contract, of the expectations we'd placed on each other. I finished the dishes in silence, but now my mind was racing. I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over, the small smile, the softness in his voice. It was like something inside him had shifted, even if just a little, and then it hit me. I had missed so many of these moments before. All these small sparks of warmth tucked away beneath layers of his controlled demeanor. I had never seen them because I hadn't known what to look for. But now I was beginning to see him, and the more I saw, the more I realized I was falling for him all over again. The evening came faster than I anticipated. It was the night of the charity gala, and David had insisted I attend with him. It wasn't the first time I'd been to such events with him, but this time felt different. This time, I was determined to do more than just blend into the background. I stood in front of the mirror, looking at myself in the red dress I had chosen, David's favorite color. It was simple, elegant, and form-fitting. The deep crimson made my pale skin glow, and my straight pink hair cascaded down my back, soft waves framing my face. For once, I didn't feel like a shadow in his life. I felt like I could actually stand out. I had spent hours deciding on this outfit. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about being noticed, about showing him that I wasn't the same woman I was before, that maybe, just maybe, I could make him see me in a different light. The moment David saw me, he stopped in his tracks. His sharp blue eyes widened for just a second, his gaze sweeping over me like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The cold, detached expression that was so familiar to me softened just a touch. "You look," He trailed off, his voice low and uncertain for once. You look different. Different. It wasn't a grand compliment, but it felt like one. It felt like the first time I wasn't just another accessory on his arm. He was seeing me, really seeing me. I smiled, though a part of me was still terrified. Do I? Is that a good thing? David blinked, and for a moment, it seemed like he wasn't sure how to answer. There was a slight shift in his posture as he approached me, his eyes tracing the outline of my dress. Then, finally, he said, Yeah, it's a good thing. I could feel my heart race at his words, the simple validation pulling something loose inside me. But I didn't let myself get too carried away. I wasn't about to assume that one comment meant everything had changed. He offered me his arm, and we walked out together. The car ride was quiet, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. A shift. We were no longer just two people stuck in a contract. There was something more. But I wasn't sure what it was yet. When we arrived at the gala, David immediately got pulled into a conversation with some of his colleagues, as expected. I stood by his side, feeling slightly out of place in the sea of glamorous faces and forced smiles. But I stayed close, determined to make the night count. We mingled for what felt like hours, and the time passed in a blur of polite conversations and well-rehearsed social niceties. I was so focused on keeping my composure that I barely noticed when David came over to me, a glass of champagne in hand. "Lily," he said, his voice surprisingly warm, "you've been quieter than usual tonight." I looked up at him, a little taken aback by the question. Usually, he never noticed when I went silent. "Just observing," I said with a half-smile. "The crowd. It's overwhelming, don't you think?" David nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he looked around the room. "Yeah, it's not really my scene either." He paused, and for a moment I could see the wariness in his eyes. "But you look like you belong here, Lily, more than anyone else." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. It felt like he was finally starting to see me, not just as the woman in the background, but as someone with substance, someone who could hold her own. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name, something that felt like hope, something that made me ache with the possibility of something more. Before I could say anything, a well-meaning woman from the board of directors interrupted us, pulling David away with a smile and a wave. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before following him at a distance. But as the night went on, something kept gnawing at me. There was something about this gala that felt different, about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We were still the same people, still trapped in the same contract, but in the small moments between the conversations, in the way his eyes lingered just a second too long when he looked at me, I began to wonder if there was more to this story than I had ever imagined. It wasn't until late one evening, when the house was quiet and the lights were dim, that I learned something new about David. I had been walking past the hallway when I heard it. A muffled sound, a soft whimper, almost like a plea for help. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I listened closely. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard it again. David's voice, hoarse and broken. "Please don't." It was a whisper, and yet it was filled with so much fear. My chest tightened as I followed the sound to the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open, unsure of what I might find. David was sitting on the edge of the bed, his face buried in his hands. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his body trembled like he was cold, even though the room was warm. The sight of him like this, so vulnerable, shattered something inside me. I hadn't seen him like this before. I had always known David as the stoic, composed man who never let his emotions show. But this was something I hadn't anticipated. I stepped into the room quietly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the soft carpet. "David?" I called out softly, my voice tentative. He didn't respond at first, and when he did, it was with a shaky breath. "Go back to bed, Lily. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. I could see that now. His shoulders were hunched, his body rigid, and his eyes were distant, lost in some kind of nightmare only he could see. "David," I said again, a little louder this time, crossing the room slowly. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, his hands clenched into fists, his body trembling more violently now. He looked like he was fighting something, some invisible enemy. And I realized then that he wasn't just suffering from some passing nightmare. He was trapped in his own mind, held captive by whatever haunted him. I moved closer, my heart aching for him, despite all the emotional distance we had kept between us for so long. "David," I whispered, this time sitting beside him on the bed. "You don't have to do this alone." His eyes snapped to mine, filled with a mix of surprise and pain. "I'm not alone," he said bitterly. "I've always been alone." The words struck me harder than I expected, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I reached out, my hand resting lightly on his. "You don't have to be," I said gently. "I'm here, David." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, as if the weight of his emotions was too much to hold back, he let out a long, shuddering breath. His guard finally lowered, just enough for me to see the raw, fragile man beneath all the armor he wore. "I can't sleep," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The nightmares, they won't stop." My heart ached even more. "What kind of nightmares?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. David hesitated before answering, his eyes darkening. "The same ones about him, my brother." I knew then. I had heard enough to understand. David's younger brother, the one who had been in a coma for years, the one David blamed himself for. I didn't press him for more details. Instead, I simply sat there beside him, offering the only comfort I could, my presence. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After a long silence, I spoke again. "If you want, I could stay, just until you fall asleep." David looked at me, his expression conflicted. "You don't have to." "I want to," I said softly, my voice steady despite the fear I felt in my chest. It wasn't just about helping him. It was about something else. Something that had been growing inside me for days now, something I couldn't ignore any longer. Without waiting for him to respond, I stood and walked around to his side of the bed. "I'll just sleep on the other side," I added, trying to keep the situation light, though my heart was pounding. David's gaze lingered on me for a moment, but he didn't protest. He simply nodded and shifted over to make space for me. I slid under the covers, careful not to disturb him too much, but as I settled into the bed, I couldn't ignore the fact that I was right beside him again. I hadn't slept beside him in months, perhaps even longer. The last time we had shared a bed, it felt like a lifetime ago. And now it felt strangely familiar. David turned onto his side, facing away from me, but I could still see the tension in his body. He was still awake, still struggling with whatever demons haunted him. "Go to sleep, David," I murmured, reaching out and gently placing my hand on his arm. "I'm here. You're not alone." For a long moment he didn't respond, but eventually I heard the sound of his breathing calming, the tension leaving his body little by little. And though the night was long and filled with uncertainty, I knew I had made the right decision. I wasn't just staying because he needed help. I was staying because I needed this too. I needed to be close to him, even if it was just for tonight. It had been a quiet few days after I had stayed with David in his bed. Though we hadn't discussed it, something unspoken had shifted between us. There was an ease now in the way we moved around each other, an unacknowledged closeness that I wasn't sure how to navigate, but I felt it all the same. The coldness that had defined our marriage was starting to thaw, but there was still so much I didn't understand. David's nightmares, the secrecy he kept about his brother, and now the strange distance that always seemed to be between him and his company. It was like there were layers to him I hadn't yet uncovered. It was a Sunday afternoon when I first noticed something off. David was in his study, talking in a low voice on the phone. He hadn't seen me walk past the open door, and I, unknowingly, stood there for a few moments listening as the conversation unfolded. "I don't care about the consequences." David's voice was firm, his tone colder than I had ever heard it. "We need to act now before he gets any closer." A pause. "No, I don't trust him. Not with this. We can't let anyone else get involved, not even the board." There was another pause, and I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling on the desk. "I'll take care of it. But you need to be ready. This could get ugly." I couldn't move, frozen at the edge of the door. David's voice had changed. There was an edge to it now, one I hadn't recognized before. It was a far cry from the calm, detached man I'd been living with. I strained to hear more, but then the line went silent for a moment. I stepped back, retreating further into the shadows of the hallway, hoping to avoid being noticed. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help myself. There was something in his voice that told me this wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about the company or the profits. It was personal. I waited for David to end the call, but I was too anxious to stay hidden for long. He had never acted like this before, not even when he was facing the highest stakes. There was something deeper at play, something he was hiding from me. When I could finally bring myself to approach the study door again, it was locked. I could see David's silhouette through the frosted glass, pacing back and forth. My mind raced as I thought about what I'd overheard. Business enemies? Who could David have angered so much that it warranted secrecy? And why had he been so insistent on not involving anyone else? I glanced down at the phone in my hand, the one I'd been meaning to call my mother with. But now my thoughts were consumed by something else entirely. I couldn't ignore the feeling that David was in danger, real danger. The way his voice had cracked, the subtle undertone of panic, it was unlike him. I had to do something. I had to figure out what he was involved in, even if he didn't want me to know. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was happening, it was somehow tied to the accident I'd witnessed before. Maybe David wasn't just an innocent bystander after all. Maybe his death had been no accident. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to go about my usual routine, but my mind was a whirlwind. What if David had been targeted by someone from his past? What if those enemies he'd mentioned were the same ones who'd pushed him into that fatal accident? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled upon a clue, one that, if I followed, could reveal more than I was ready to understand. As night fell, I found myself standing by the study door again, not knowing what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand the truth. But another part of me knew that pushing him too hard would only make him retreat further into the walls he'd built around himself. No, I needed a plan. I needed to get close to the truth, but carefully. If I could uncover who was behind this, if I could stop them before it was too late, I could save David, and in the process, save us both. The days that followed my discovery of David's secret call were strange. It was as if the universe had decided to keep us at arm's length, pushing us to the brink of something we couldn't fully understand yet. David was distant, preoccupied, his usual routine unchanged. But there was a heaviness to him now, a quiet weight that I couldn't ignore. He had become more elusive, retreating further into himself every time I tried to bring up anything personal. The walls he had built around his emotions were taller than ever before. And yet, I couldn't help but notice the small cracks forming in him. The fleeting moments where his gaze softened, where his voice held something unspoken, something vulnerable. It was as though I had gotten a glimpse of the man behind the fortress, but only for a second, before it vanished again. That afternoon, after returning from yet another meeting, David surprised me with a simple statement. "I'm going to visit someone. Do you want to come with me?" I looked up from the book I was pretending to read, startled by the offer. David was not the type to invite anyone along to his personal errands. His privacy was sacred, and I had come to respect that over the years, even if it often left me feeling like a stranger in my own home. I blinked, 1,000 questions rushing to my mind. "Who are you visiting?" I asked, my voice tentative. He hesitated for just a moment before speaking, his eyes avoiding mine. "A family member, my brother." My heart skipped a beat. My curiosity piqued. I had known about David's family, his estranged father, his distant relatives, but never had he mentioned a brother. Not once in the years we'd been married, not even in passing. The idea of him having a brother was new, and my thoughts instantly spiraled. His brother? I had never heard him speak of this person. The layers of secrecy around David were suddenly thicker, and my suspicion deepened. What was he hiding? Why had he kept this from me? Is he okay?" I asked carefully, trying to sound casual, though my voice trembled with the weight of the unspoken. David glanced at me, his gaze guarded. "He's in a coma. Has been for a few years now." I froze. A comatose brother. This was a part of David's life I had never even known existed. A part of him that had been hidden, locked away behind the walls he had built to keep everyone out. I tried to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the swell of emotion rising within me. "I didn't know you had a brother. Why didn't you tell me?" David's lips pressed together into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke. His tone quieter now, softer. I didn't think it mattered. But I could feel it. It mattered. It mattered more than anything else. This was the missing piece of the puzzle I hadn't even realized I was looking for. The man I had married, this distant, closed-off person, was hiding a pain that had shaped him in ways I hadn't imagined. "Can we go see him?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. David hesitated, and for the first time I saw the brief flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, regret, a deep sadness that he tried to bury but could never fully erase. "Sure," he said finally, his voice rough. We drove in silence, the weight of the unspoken words between us hanging heavy in the car. When we arrived at the hospital, David led me through the sterile, quiet hallways, his steps heavy, purposeful. I followed closely behind, unsure of how to act, of what to say. We reached a small private room at the end of a hallway, the door partially open. The soft beep of machines filled the silence as we entered. David's brother lay in the bed, his face pale and still, hooked up to various machines. The tubes, the wires, it was a painful sight. I could see the resemblance between them now, the sharp features, the same nose, the same strong jawline. But the man in front of me was a shadow of the person David had once known. David stood at the edge of the bed for a long moment, his fingers twitching at his sides. He said nothing, just stared at his brother, his face blank, unreadable. But I could feel the depth of his emotion, the grief, the guilt, the love, all swirling beneath the surface. I took a step closer, placing a hand gently on his arm. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but I could feel the tension in him. "David," I whispered, my voice soft, coaxing. "What happened?" He finally turned to me, his face a mask of exhaustion and heartache. "I don't know. One day he just didn't come back. He was in a car accident. I don't know what happened after that. It was all a blur." I could see the pain in his eyes, the unresolved grief that still haunted him. It was clear now. David wasn't just a man living with the guilt of a family tragedy. He was living with the trauma of not knowing the full truth, the aftermath of a life that had been irrevocably changed in an instant. "You don't have to tell me," I said, my voice barely a whisper, knowing that this wasn't something he was ready to share. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. "But whatever happened, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." David's eyes softened for the briefest moment. Then, without saying a word, he reached out and took my hand in his, the smallest of gestures. But it was everything, a crack in his shell. "I don't know what I'm doing, Lily," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." I squeezed his hand, feeling the rawness of his words. "You don't have to do it alone," I whispered, my heart aching for him. "I'm here, and I'm not going to leave you." For the first time in so long, I saw a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or something just as fragile, inside David's eyes. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start the healing. For both of us. The drive to David's childhood home was unlike any I had experienced before. He was quieter than usual, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as though the journey itself was a personal pilgrimage, a return to a past that had been buried, or perhaps never fully left behind. We didn't talk much during the drive. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a delicate truce forged out of the shared weight of unvoiced truths. David had opened up about his brother's accident, about the pain he had carried for years, but there were still so many things unsaid, so many pieces of him that remained just out of reach. The house, if it could even be called that, was a large, imposing structure at the edge of town, nestled between the jagged trees lined the dirt road. It was grand in a way that felt cold, almost unwelcoming. The windows were dark, the front yard overgrown with weeds, the paint peeling in places as if the house itself had grown tired over the years. We parked in the long driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. I could see the tension in David's posture as he cut the engine, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. For a moment, neither of us moved. "I haven't been back here in years," he said finally, his voice a whisper of something old and heavy. "Not since everything happened." I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was no right way to respond to such a statement, no comforting words that could erase the weight of his past, so I simply stayed silent, waiting for him to lead the way. David got out of the car, walking slowly toward the front door. I followed close behind, my footsteps cautious on the uneven ground. When we stepped inside, I was immediately hit with the smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly nostalgic. The air felt heavy, saturated with memories that clung to every corner of the house. The walls were lined with faded photographs, portraits of a younger David, smiling with people I didn't recognize. Family, perhaps, or old friends. He didn't say much as we walked through the rooms, his gaze distant, as though he was seeing everything through a fog. I wanted to reach out, to ask him about the photographs, about the people in them, but I didn't. There was a fragile quality to this moment, a quiet reverence that made me hesitant to break the silence. Finally, we reached a room at the back of the house, a small study filled with bookshelves and old furniture. A large window overlooked the yard, and in the far corner there was a desk cluttered with papers, a chair that looked well-worn, as though it had been the place where David spent countless hours thinking, working, or perhaps retreating. David walked over to the desk, running a hand along the surface as if reacquainting himself with the space. I stood at the door, unsure of how to approach him, unsure of what he needed from me in this moment. His walls were back up again, the distance between us growing with every second. "You used to sit here a lot, didn't you?" I asked gently, trying to break the silence. He looked at me, his eyes flickering with something, regret, maybe, or the remnants of a memory. "Yeah, I used to. When I needed to think, or when I wanted to be alone." I took a step closer, carefully sitting on the edge of the desk, watching him as he stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest. "Do you miss it here?" I asked, my voice soft, almost tentative. David was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, before he finally spoke, his words low and heavy. "I don't know if I miss it. I think I miss the person I was when I was here, before everything got complicated." I nodded, understanding more than I could express. We had both lost pieces of ourselves along the way. But it was more than that. It was the way time and circumstance had chipped away at who we had been, leaving behind versions of ourselves that were harder to recognize, harder to hold on to. David turned away from the window then, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like hours. There was a softness in his expression now, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to see. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice raw. "I'm sorry for everything." I didn't know what to say. The weight of his apology hung between us, heavy and laden with more than just words. It was an admission, an opening, a crack in the fortress he had built around himself. Before I could respond, David stepped closer, his gaze intense, and for the briefest moment the world seemed to stop. His face softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Slow, unsure, but real. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile like that, and it took my breath away. For a moment, it felt like everything was right, like we were finally connected in a way that hadn't been possible before. The distance between us, the years of silence and pain, seemed to vanish in the warmth of that smile. "I never knew how to smile after everything happened," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But you make me want to try again." And in that moment, I realized something. We had both been broken, but we were slowly mending, one step at a time. The journey ahead would still be hard, the scars we carried would never fully fade, but there was hope now. There was a chance for something more. David took a step forward, his hand reaching out, and I didn't hesitate this time. I let him take my hand, and as we stood there together in that quiet room, I couldn't help but smile back at him. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the same side. The evening had settled into a comfortable silence as David and I sat on the balcony, the faint hum of the city below us blending with the cool breeze. The sky above had softened into deep shades of purple and indigo, the stars beginning to peek through the darkening canvas. There was something peaceful about this moment, something that felt like the calm before a storm. But this time, the storm didn't feel threatening. It felt like the kind of storm that cleared the air, that brought change. I had been waiting for him to speak, waiting for the moment when the words that had been unspoken between us would finally be brought into the light. The truth, however painful, was something that we could no longer avoid. It had hung between us for too long, like a shadow we couldn't outrun. "I think we need to stop pretending," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, my heart beating faster in my chest. It wasn't a surprise, not really. We both knew that the facade we had been putting up, the cold distance, the pretenses, couldn't last forever, not if we were going to make it through this journey together. I agree, I replied, my voice steady, though the tremor in my chest betrayed me. No more lies. David met my gaze then, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. There was no barrier between us now, no walls to keep us apart. For the first time, I could see him for who he truly was. Not the CEO, not the distant husband, but the man behind the mask. I want us to be honest, he said, his voice low but resolute. For the next 100 days, no pretending, no hiding parts of ourselves. We owe it to each other. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I had been terrified of this moment, the moment when we would have to face the truth, when everything would change. But somehow, hearing David's words felt like a promise that we could be vulnerable with each other, that we could let go of the past and rebuild something real. I'll try my best, I said, my voice quieter now, almost tentative. But it's going to be hard. We've spent so much time hiding, so much time pretending that things were okay. David's hand reached for mine then, his fingers brushing against mine in a soft, almost reverent gesture. The touch was simple, but it carried with it a weight of meaning that made my heart flutter in my chest. We can't keep living like this, he said. I don't want to. I want us to actually have something, Lily, something real. I felt a lump form in my throat at his words. He had always been so guarded, so distant, that hearing him speak so openly, so honestly, felt like a revelation. For the first time, I truly believed that he wanted something more than just the facade of a contract marriage. He wanted us. He wanted me. I want that too, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I want to stop hiding. I want us to have a chance. David squeezed my hand, his gaze never leaving mine. It felt like the moment we had both been waiting for, the moment when the weight of our past and all the hurt and confusion melted away, leaving us with something new, something fragile but beautiful. We'll take it one day at a time, David said, his voice steady but full of conviction. No more pretending. Just us. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I nodded, the decision settling in my heart. The next 100 days wouldn't be easy. There'd be challenges, painful moments when the truth hurt more than we anticipated, but there would also be moments of intimacy, of growth, of real connection, and somehow that felt worth the risk. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of clarity. The uncertainty that had clouded my thoughts for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet certainty. David was right. We couldn't keep pretending. But now there was hope. There was the possibility of something real, something lasting. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized that this was the beginning of something new, something we would build together, piece by piece, day by day. David leaned forward then, his lips brushing against my forehead in a tender, almost reverent kiss. It was a promise, an unspoken vow that we were in this together, that we would face whatever came our way, no matter how difficult or uncertain the path ahead seemed. I'm here, he whispered against my skin. I'll be here for you, Lily. I know, I murmured, my voice barely audible as I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of his words sink in. And in that moment, I felt something shift between us. It was a subtle change, a quiet understanding, but it was enough. We had made a pact, and now there was no going back.